Chapter 25, Gestal, Lord Emperor of the Empire.
Chere! Are you all right? Locke!
Chere cried, and jumped to her feet just as the thief caught up to her and the others, throwing his arms around her in a rather jumbled hug.
Are you all right?
Locke asked again, and Chere nodded, pulling away a little to push her hair from out of her eyes.
I'm fine. Mog and Gao. They protected me from Kefka.
Chere smiled gratefully at the two smaller returners, who smiled back at her. Locke let out a sigh of relief and stepped back, pushing his bandana up on his forehead.
So Kefka was there. But I suppose you managed to talk to the Espers if Gao and Mog fought him off. Yes, I did, but...
Chere trailed off.
We lost Setzer. No, you didn't.
Setzer suddenly exclaimed as he ran up to the group. Chere blinked and couldn't help but point her finger at him as if he were a ghost.
Where did you come from? The same exit you did, silly.
Setzer laughed and crossed his arms over his chest.
Although I couldn't find a way back into the sealed gate, so I flew back to Narsh with speeds faster than I had ever seen the Blackjack use, and picked up Locke and the others. The rest are waiting on board. So that is how Locke got here too.
Chere nodded and pressed her lips together in worry. Mog seemed to be reading her mind.
The Espers flew off together. I know.
Setzer said, his tone now darker as he looked to Locke. Locke sighed again and put his hands on his hips.
But what way did they go?
Chere asked worriedly.
Toward the capital. Towards Vector.
Setzer trailed off, and Chere gasped.
We have to go to Vector now. We have to make sure they don't do anything horrible. Don't have to tell me twice.
Locke cried.
Let's hurry up and go.
The reunion on the deck of the airship was short-lived as Setzer demanded that everyone go down into the lower decks so that they would not be in danger when he raced the Blackjack to Vector. However, Edgar and Locke insisted they stay aboard to be with Chere while Setzer piloted, and Chere consented. Setzer revved up the engine and they took off roughly, the entire ship shaking violently as it lifted from the ground.
We'll be at Vector soon.
Setzer called back to the others, but Chere was no longer paying attention. She was staring outside of the ship, and her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, but wasn't quite sure of what that might be. She walked past Locke and Edgar towards the nose of the ship, her eyes narrowed as the wind whipped through her ponytail.
There!
Chere suddenly cried, and pointed out in the distance at something small and sparkling. It almost resembled a shooting star in the middle of the daytime sky. Locke blinked and raised his hand over his forehead.
What's wrong, Chere?
He asked, and Setzer looked up from the wheel to see what she was talking about also.
I can feel it. It's coming closer and closer. What do you mean, you can feel it?
Locke asked again, his tone slightly upset.
It was glowing.
Chere cried again, and Locke frowned as he looked away from Chere and back into the sky, where he finally saw what she had seen. Chere became transfixed as the light came closer and closer, but Locke realized what was happening and became alarmed.
An Esper!
He cried.
Watch out, Chere!
However, Chere did not reply, and before they could be struck, Locke dove on top of her and knocked her to the deck just as the Esper whooshed over their heads and nearly smashed into Setzer.
Ah!
Setzer cried, struggling to keep his grip on the wheel.
What the hell was that? Setzer, get down!
Locke cried, and with that, dove on top of Setzer too, just before another barrage of Espers ran through. Setzer gulped and closed his eyes tightly.
Espers! Where are they going?
Locke cried, sitting up from Setzer a bit. Chere calmly pushed herself up to her knees and stared at Locke.
They were mad. They seemed slightly angry.
Locke said a little sarcastically. More espers flew past the airship off into the distance, passing the sealed gate and crossing the ocean until they disappeared from the returner's view. Edgar made his way over to the wheel carefully to steer in Setzer's place as he recovered, and Chere climbed to her feet, cupping her hands over her mouth as she called out.
No! Stop! Please don't go!
Suddenly, the ship let out a violent lurch and the floor deck began to shake heavily. The returners in the deck below could be heard calling out and squealing over the sudden new commotion.
Forget the espers!
Setzer cried as he ran his hands over the deck.
What's with this vibration? Is it from the espers? Or is the engine?
Setzer? Edgar asked, and Setzer looked up at the young king, who looked terrified as he released his hands from the wheel, which was rotating in violent, swift circles all on its own.
I've lost control. I.e.
Chere cried, and latched onto the closest thing to her, Locke's leg, as the blackjack took a sudden nosedive and in a mess of smoke and screams, half slid and half crash-landed in a small bundle of trees near the city of Miranda, an occupied town not too far away from Vector. There was a terrific boom of snapping tree branches and scraping ship parts as the blackjack slid to a complete stop nearly right outside the boundaries of the forest, but other than that, it was not really a dramatic crash. Chere groaned and let go of Locke's leg as she stood up and shook leaves and twigs off her clothing. Locke, Edgar, and Setzer stood up also, and the other returners crawled up from below deck, all groaning about bruises and bumps as they piled onto the upper deck. Locke stood up on a toppled-over crate and raised his hands to silence the chattering for now.
Is everyone okay?
He asked, and there came a chorus of yes and yes. Locke let out a sigh of relief and pressed his hands together.
All right, now listen up. The espers were heading towards Vector, and they apparently reached it and didn't find what they wanted, so they turned around and are now God knows where. However, we're now stuck here, so we may as well check out Vector together and see if anything happened, since we can't chase after them. Kefka may have returned to tell Gestal that Chere opened the gate, and well, who knows what the hell the Empire is plotting next. However, we should be fine if we just stick together. Good idea, Locke.
Sabin nodded.
Let's all confront Kefka together. He doesn't stand a chance then. I'm all for it.
Chere rubbed at her forehead and stared at the others.
I really should apologize for this mess. It's not your fault, Miss Chere.
Cyan cried.
You did your best, it was all any of us could hope for.
Chere smiled a little and bowed in appreciation.
Let's just see if there is any aftermath.
Locke said.
I hope Arvis and Bannon are okay. They came with us on the airship, and asked to be dropped off in Vector.
Setzer supplied quickly, and Chere raised her eyebrows.
Then we should hurry. It's not safe for them there. Grab whatever equipment you can find that you can use, and meet outside the ship in 5 minutes.
Locke ordered, and with that, leapt down from his crate and tugged on Edgar's cape, gesturing for him to follow him off the airship. As the others scampered around to search for lost weapons and armor bangles, Chere let out a small sigh and buried her head in her hands. She was positive that there was no way things could get any worse. Of course, her very best, as Cyan put it, did nothing worthwhile for the team, and now there were enraged espers flying out and about, probably ready to decimate every town on the world map.
Please, let something positive come out of all this.
Chere mumbled into her hands.
Anything.
Locke was the first to see the long trails of smoke coming from the woods that Vector was settled into, striking fear into his heart, for the first thing he thought of was a raging forest fire. However, that was not the case. As the line of returners marched into the forest and came upon the mechanical city of Vector, they were all surprised to see that the smoke and fire was actually coming from within it. Many wooden roofs of the poorer-built homes were lit on fire, as well as crates and barrels outside the homes. However, it almost seemed under control as the owners of the homes ran back and forth from the woods to the town, carrying buckets of damp soil to throw upon the fires. But other than the poorer people of Vector, the city was also filled with many returners Chere recognized from the hidden base off the Leet River, and even more surprisingly, not a single officer of the Empire. A few of Narsh's guards were also wandering about, looking at everything in awe and wonder. Edgar pointed up on the stairs of the Imperial Palace, where Bannon and Arvis were safely surveying the scenery from above.
I wonder what happened.
Sabin trailed off as the group ran up the stairs towards the pair of elderly returners.
I bet it was the Espers.
Mog gulped as he took in everything around him.
Espers do bad stuff?
Gao questioned confusedly.
But I thought Espers not bad. What a horrible mess. What a relief that Doma did not experience anything like this.
Cyan added in nervously.
Locke, Tara.
Arvis called.
And everyone else.
Bannon exclaimed.
What happened?
Tara cried breathlessly, and Bannon and Arvis looked at each other.
Truthfully, it was like this when we arrived,
Arvis said, and Tara gasped.
We heard a commotion as we were getting through the woods, and there were Imperials running past us and screaming like there was no tomorrow. I guess it was feasible they should think that though, based on what all happened. So it was the Espers.
Tara tried to hold back a sob as she covered her mouth and hiccuped.
Tara, it wasn't your fault.
Mog trailed off, and Tara looked away. Bannon and Arvis raised questioning eyebrows at Locke, who shrugged them off. Gao suddenly let out a small growl of warning, and Locke looked up, only to see that they had been sneakily joined by a tall, pale, pasty man dressed in robes of scarlet and cream, a small white mask covering the lower portion of his face, and a taller scarlet cap that hid the top portion of his head, only revealing his beady, black eyes. Edgar quickly pulled Tara closer to his side, who gasped in surprise when she looked up and saw the intruder for herself.
Who are you?
Cyan demanded, and the man did a slight bow.
I am the Chancellor of the Imperial Palace. Come. The Emperor is expecting you. Expecting us.
Locke cried, but the Chancellor said no more. He merely turned and began to walk away, swiftly climbing the remaining steps that led to the Imperial Palace.
Should we go, Bannon?
Sabin asked, and Bannon nodded a little, folding his hands together.
Go see what Gastal wants. We'll take care of things out here. But it could be a trap.
Edgar cried, and Tara shook her head.
For some reason, I do not feel that is the case.
She bit her lip and looked up at Edgar.
Besides, even if it is, I have to meet him. This Emperor Gastal. He is the man behind all of this mess, right?
Edgar didn't quite know what to say, and Tara looked down at the ground.
He is the man who murdered my mother. Of course we'll go, Tara.
Locke suddenly said, and gave her back a slight pat.
Don't worry, with all of us together, he won't be able to pull anything.
With Tara leading, the group then followed the Chancellor into the looming metal palace, and down its main corridor, passing many uniformed Imperial soldiers on the way. However, instead of sneering at the returners, the soldiers merely waved and carried on with their business. Chere raised her eyebrows and cautiously waved back as she continued down the red carpet behind the Chancellor. At last, they came to a pair of double doors which the Chancellor pulled open and gestured for them to file inside. As soon as the last person stepped inside, he slammed the doors shut and caused everyone to jump, with Mog letting out a little kupo. However, this was followed by soft chuckling from the front of the room. There, sitting on one of two metal-plated thrones, was Emperor Gestal himself, strangely the same as he had been in the 20-year-old younger form the returners had gotten to see back in Zozo. He was sitting up and laughing quietly to himself, politely covering his mouth with his hand as the returners all turned to stare at him. Finally, the laughter ceased, and Gestal cleared his throat, smiling brightly.
"Welcome, welcome, thank you for coming here on such short notice,"
he began.
"I can imagine how hard it must have been for you to trust me and come to my home. But before another word is said, I must tell you this now, I have lost my will to fight."
"What?" Chere whispered under her breath, and at that moment, the bumbling Professor Sid emerged from a door behind Gestal, much to Locke, Edgar, and Cyan's surprise. They figured Kefka would have finished him off for sure by now.
"The Emperor has had a change of heart,"
Sid cried, and Locke raised his eyebrows.
"Sid? What are you doing here?" "I live here, thank you,"
Sid replied, and his tone turned serious as he crossed his arms over his chest.
"The Espers came to save their friends. When they learned the others had perished, they went berserk, and trashed the town. Never will I forget their shrieks of rage."
Chere let out a little gasp, and a sentry, which had previously kept himself hidden from the returners' attentions, spoke up from a corner.
"We're hanging up our weapons and armor for good."
Gestal sighed and pressed his hands together.
"The power of those Espers! I had no idea. They'll shred the world. We must get them to understand that we are no longer at war."
Locke blinked and Edgar crossed his arms over his chest.
"No human's gonna make them sit down and listen."
Sid trailed off. However, Gestal suddenly broke into another smile and jumped up.
"But for now, my friends, let us feast and rejoice." "What the hell? Kupo?"
Mog muttered.
"Something does smell yummy, now that Gao think about it."
Gao whispered as he sniffed in the air. Sure enough, there was the definite makings of a grand feast being held somewhere nearby. Chere stepped forward, her arms rested across her chest.
"We'll accept your invitation to dinner." "Very good."
Gestal smiled more, and Sid stepped up to Chere.
"But there are still some people who would prefer to keep fighting."
He trailed off.
"Please, before we dine, would you go around and talk to as many soldiers as you can in the palace? Can you make them understand?"
Chere raised her eyebrows, but she also nodded in understanding.
"We can do that. Thank you,"
Gestal said gratefully, and prepared to retreat in the back room Sid had come out of.
"Dinner will be this evening, at 6 o'clock sharp. Don't be late, hee, you won't want to miss this. My chefs have simply outdone themselves. We'll be there,"
Sabin offered, and with that, Gestal and Sid made their exits. Chere turned to stare at the others, a slight frown on her face.
"That was too easy." "Well, that may be, but let's just go around and chat it up with a few of the soldiers like he asked, hey?"
Edgar suggested, and suddenly pulled a small bottle of cologne out of his robes, spraying at his wrists and neck.
"Edgar, what are you doing?"
Sabin cried, and Edgar flashed him a big smile.
Surely, little brother, there are ladies to be afoot?
Edgar asked, and laughed happily at the shocked look on Sabin's face as he pushed through the returners and made his exit into the main hall of the castle. Chere blinked and Locke groaned, slapping his forehead. Chere stifled a slight yawn as she wondered what she felt was the same corridor she had travelled the entire evening since her dismissal from Gestalt. She desperately wished she had some sort of way of knowing the time, so that she could know when this rather boring torture would be over with. However, she had not come across one clock the entire time she had been out and about. However, she had most definitely done her part of the bargain. For dinner she stumbled upon an entire quarter of soldiers and stood in the doorway nervously as she proposed Gestalt's plan of peace with the returners to them. One soldier, boiling with rage at this, and probably drunk as well, threw an empty glass bottle at Chere, who immediately cast Vanish on herself and watched as the bottle flew right through her body. She decided to also take that time to make her escape as the soldiers all gasped and pushed each other around to seek her out.
I'm feeling terribly sleepy,
Chere moaned, and gently slapped at her cheeks.
But I must stay alert. I can't depend on the others to analyze Gestalt and that weird professor the entire night, so I have to stay on my guard as well.
Chere turned a corner and came across a place unfamiliar to her, which gave her the inkling that perhaps she had not been going in circles after all. However, as she proceeded down the hall, she could hear familiar shouts of anger and moans of disgust coming from one of the doorways in the corridor. As Chere stepped up on her tiptoes to peek through the small window on the door, she could see that it was actually a jail cell, a cold, drippy one at that, with steel walls and a steel floor, and alas, a matching steel toilet. However, it was the figure jumping up and down on his bed that really stole her attention. A rather ruffled up Kefka screaming and throwing a hissy fit as he shook his fists and kicked at the walls.
Grr! How dare they put me in a place like this? I don't believe this!
Kefka squirmed and hopped off his bed, running around the room and kicking at whatever he could that made a nice, loud banging noise against the tip of his boots. His eyes fell on the toilet, where he proceeded to kick it and beat it senseless, well, if a toilet had senses, until he finally gave up and heaved himself down upon it, at which point Chere widened her eyes and turned her back to him to let him have whatever private dignity he could salvage, and began to promptly walk away.
What a bore!
Kefka said to himself as he sat there and mused about his revenge on Gestalt. A few moments later, Chere ran into Locke, who was smiling to himself as he came around the same corner as her and accidentally smacked into her front. Chere gasped and stumbled back as Locke squealed and bent down, trying to salvage the shiny objects he had managed to pick up on his tour of the palace. Chere blinked and shook her head, pretending not to look as Locke stuffed the last GP in his pocket and whistled innocently.
Chere!
He exclaimed.
Sorry about that. What have you been up to? I've been horribly lost,
Chere admitted.
But I did see Kefka. Kefka!
Locke suddenly cried, his pockets jingling as he grabbed Cere's shoulders.
Did he hurt you? No, he was in jail,
Chere exclaimed, and Locke blinked, pulling away as he scratched at his head.
Jail, Something we will have to ask Gestalt about tonight, I guess. Oh. Speaking of which, that's what I was sent to do. Go get you, because dinner is about to begin. Thank the gods, I'm starving,
Chere cried, and rubbed her stomach.
Lead the way.
Locke took her down the hall and through a few other confusing twists and turns until they finally reached the main corridor and went back up through the throne room into the back door Gestalt had used earlier. There, a long table, sized enough to sit at least 20 people, was covered in a fancy white tablecloth and covered with steaming hot dishes and delicate gold candle holders and lit candles. Gastal and 4 chancellors sat on one side of the table, while the returners had all crowded on the other side, leaving a seat in the middle of the table across from Gastal empty for Chere. Chere sat down and Locke took his place beside her, and Edgar elbowed Chere from her other side, giving her a wink.
"Meet a nice guy,"
he whispered, and Chere turned red as she shook her head and looked up at Gastal. Sid suddenly burst in and took a seat at the returner's side of the table, next to Cyan, who stared at him.
"You can count me in as a returner,"
Sid exclaimed, and nodded to Gastal. Gastal nodded back approvingly and looked to Chere, smiling as a maid began to walk around the table and fill the guests' glasses with a sweet strawberry wine.
"Imagine!"
Gastal exclaimed, and smiled more.
"All of us here together, sharing a meal. First, we must have a toast. But to whom?"
He raised his glass and the others followed, with Chere speaking up.
"To our hometowns." "Well then, to our hometowns!"
Gastal exclaimed, and everyone clinked their glass against the persons next to them, Locke giving Chere a wink as he hit her glass.
"Good job, kiddo,"
he whispered, and Chere smiled, feeling a little less nervous. Gastal took a long sip of his drink and set the glass down, folding his hands together as the maid then began to place servings of food down on the returners' plates.
"As you know, Kefka's in jail for his war crimes. What shall we do with him?"
The returners that didn't know this murmured quietly among themselves, but Locke raised his hand and spoke.
"Leave him in jail. For now." "That is a good idea."
Gastal nodded.
"Let's let him stew in his cell for a while. And then we can decide what to do."
He sighed a little, and then turned to Cyan.
"I truly apologize about the poisoning of Doma. No one dreamed Kefka would actually use poison."
Cyan sat up a little straighter and narrowed his eyes some as he folded his hands in his lap.
"That was inexcusable,"
he said boldly, and the others nodded to back him up.
"I'm so terribly sorry."
Gastal apologized.
"Kefka's being severely punished, and we're taking it upon ourselves to clean up the poison."
He cleared his throat and swept his gaze over the returners.
"By the way, with regard to General Celes."
Locke closed his eyes and looked down, and seeing his pained expression, Chere raised her hand and Gastal nodded to her.
"Celes was one of us,"
Chere declared, and Locke looked up at her in surprise. Setzer nodded a little to himself, and took a sip of his drink. Gastal smiled a little, but Chere did not soften her firm tone.
"Kefka was lying. General Celes realized that this war was stupid before anyone else. That is why she joined the returners."
Locke looked up and felt as if he were about to choke on air. Celes wasn't a spy. That meant that day in the Magitech research facility, he had. Locke moaned a little and Chere turned to him alarmingly.
"Are you all right?"
Chere whispered, as Mog asked Gastal a question about Narsha's welfare. Locke nodded a little and looked at Edgar and Cyan, who also had the same guilty looks set on their faces.
"I'm fine. Drinkov went down the wrong tube."
Locke laughed a little and waved Chere away.
"Don't worry."
Chere blinked and gently patted Locke's back, smiling more.
"But you must be really happy about Celes though. Any more questions for me?"
Gastal interrupted, and Sabin raised his hand.
"Why did you start the war?" "My desire for power got the best of me. Now I've come to my senses. With your permission, I'd like to talk about the Espers." One more question, please.
Gao suddenly burst out, and Gastal nodded, smiling at the young man.
What is it, son? Why you want peace now?
Gao asked curiously, and Gastal sighed a little, leaning back in his chair.
I feel we need each other's help at this time. Don't you agree?
Gao nodded seriously, and Setzer raised his hand.
Just one more question, sir. Why did we have to talk to your men? Some of my men refused to embrace peace. I felt they'd understand if they actually met you face to face.
Setzer nodded, and put a forkful of food into his mouth, ending that discussion.
Let's talk about espers now.
Chere urged gently, just so that the emperor would not get impatient.
Aha, excellent idea, Chere.
He frowned a little though, and cleared his throat.
My empire's been decimated by the espers that emerged from the sealed gate. They're acting spiteful. Unless they're stopped, they'll rip the world asunder. Yes.
Chere slowly admitted.
The espers have gone too far. After the espers went on their rampage, I knew I couldn't go on with my war. I asked myself why I had started it in the first place. By the way, about those questions you asked me. That was the first one you asked, correct?
Chere raised her eyebrows, but did nod in confirmation. Gastal nodded back.
Right. Anyway, more than anything I want peace. That's my true dream. I want you to understand that. You seem a bit tired.
Sid offered.
Care for a rest break? Yes, let's take a break.
Chere agreed, feeling the fatigue Gastal must have been feeling too.
All will be put right if we can just achieve peace.
Sid exclaimed happily, and pardoned himself. Chere did so also, and went out into the hallway alone, pacing about to keep her thoughts in check and her body awake. Inside the dining room, she could hear Locke and Edgar accepting a challenge to duel a pair of the chancellors, which they won quite easily. Chere noticed that Sid was coming back and decided that it was time she returned too. She went back inside the dining room and took her seat, with Sid following a couple of moments later. Gastal looked a little more refreshed himself, and Locke and Edgar were slipping each other victory signs as they both sat down.
Shall we begin again?
Gastal questioned, and Chere nodded.
Is there anything you wish for me to say? That your war is truly over?
Chere trailed off, and Gastal stared at her straight in the eyes. Chere felt a little uneasy and slid back more in her chair. Those eyes. They had been the last thing her mother had ever seen.
I understand,
Gastal said firmly.
And I have ordered for this war to be over. But now, I must ask for a favor. I knew it.
Locke hissed, and Chere kicked him in the leg to keep him quiet.
After they devastated my empire, the espers headed northward, toward Crescent Island. They must be found. We must tell them we're no longer their enemy. After all that I have put them through, it is up to me to set things right. This is why I need to borrow Cere's power. Only Chere can bridge the gap between esper and human. We must make for Crescent Island aboard the freighter from Albrook. Will you accompany me?
Chere blinked and bit her lip, thinking about it for a moment. The Empire wanted her to cooperate with them. But what choice did she have? Setzer's airship was out of commission, so there was no way they could get to Crescent Island on their own. The Empire was their best bet.
Yes, I'll go.
Chere finally agreed, and Gastal clapped his hands together.
I'll have my finest warrior accompany us as well. General Leo.
At that time, General Leo walked in from the throne room entrance into the dining hall, giving everyone a wave as he stood beside Gastal. Sabin raised his eyebrows.
I'm General Leo. Nice to meet you all.
Leo smiled, and gave a salute.
Aha! I'm sure I saw him at Doma.
Sabin whispered to himself. Leo looked over at him and Cyan right then, and frowned a little.
Sir Cyan.
Leo trailed off and shook his head.
You are the liege to the King of Doma. Please forgive me for not being there to stop Kefka. It wasn't your fault.
Cyan admitted flatly, and Leo nodded again as he looked to everyone else, and then to Gastal.
I'll be waiting for you in Albrook,
Leo said, and with that, took his exit. Gastal stood up as well, signifying the end of the banquet.
We must find the Espers and come to terms with them. You are our last hope.
Chere smiled some and bowed as she stood up and took her leave. The others soon followed her, and she led them into the corridor outside of the throne room, closing the doors so that no one could hear their discussion.
If Chere goes, I'll go,
Locke offered, and Chere looked to him.
Are you sure?
She questioned, and Locke nodded. Chere smiled warmly.
Thank you, Locke. But the rest of you stay here,
Locke ordered.
I smell a rat. Agreed,
Edgar said.
It's hard to trust the Emperor, just like that. We'll stay here and investigate,
Cyan added.
And I'll fix my blackjack,
Setzer declared, and Locke smiled.
Please do. And leave no stone unturned. Right,
Edgar exclaimed, and slapped Locke on the back.
And you too, be careful. Well, I'm off.
Setzer gave a wave.
Come to the ship if you need anything before you go, you too. Will do.
Chere smiled, and waved back before Setzer disappeared from their sight.
Oh yeah.
Edgar tapped Cere's shoulder, and she turned to him.
Albrook is a port just south of here. So don't get lost, okay? We won't.
Chere exclaimed.
Don't worry so much. Don't worry about what?
A creepy voice asked from behind them, making Chere squeal and nearly fly out of her boots. She whirled around and saw the same chancellor that had taken them to the palace standing behind them with a long piece of paper in his hands.
Nothing,
Chere cried, and wiped at her forehead.
What is it? A message from the Emperor. Because you were able to talk to so many soldiers, you are to be rewarded as follows. Imperial troops have withdrawn from South Figaro. In addition, our troops have also pulled out of Doma. We hereby give you the right to take any weapons you desire from the Imperial base to the east, near the sealed cave. And this is from the Emperor himself.
The Chancellor handed over a small blue bracelet to Chere, called a Tintinabar.
Your behavior at the banquet was impeccable. Please take this as well.
He also handed her a light pink anklet with a little red jewel dangling from it, called a charm bangle. Both were items considered to be of use in battle.
Well.
With that, creepy Chancellor slipped away, and Chere let out a sigh of relief.
He's weird. But South Figaro is liberated.
Edgar cried happily, and Cyan jumped up and down, which was a rather comic sight, coming from him.
And so is Doma. Alas, what a joyous day. You mean? Joyous night.
Locke yawned and stretched.
I sure as hell hope we aren't leaving for Crescent Island tonight. That will be way too much for me. I am afraid we won't be able to leave at all if we don't get a move on,
Chere urged, and Locke nodded tiredly.
Yeah. Better get going. Except now that I think about it, we should stop at the airship before going into Albrook. Why?
Chere cried, and Locke blinked.
Just need a tonic.
Locke nodded some and began to drag Chere away.
Plus I gotta unload all my new goods.
Edgar began to follow them and whispered in Chere's ear.
Locke gets really seasick. So don't let him near your shoes, and let him hug his tonic bottle the entire time you are on the ship.
He laughed and stepped back as Locke continued to pull the now wide-eyed Chere away.
Oh gods!
She muttered. 26. Daryl, Mistress of the Skies. Chapter End.